I never thought inheriting my grandfather's property would plunge me into a war, but that's exactly what happened. It wasn't a war with guns and soldiers, but one fought with bylaws, legal documents, and the sheer unyielding stubbornness of one woman who had decided she was the queen of our little neighborhood. The whole mess started, as so many things do, with a death and a key. My grandfather, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with grease and whose quiet competence I'd always admired, passed away at the ripe old age of 87. He left me his house, the 2 acres it sat on, and most importantly, the massive corrugated steel workshop he'd built himself back in the 70s. My name is Mark, and I'm a custom metal fabricator. I make everything from ornate driveway gates to bespoke furniture and structural components for custom homes. It's a niche business, and it requires space. A lot of space. For years, I'd been operating out of a cramped, rented industrial unit on the other side of town, constantly dreaming of a place where my tools wouldn't be fighting for floor space with my materials. My grandfather's workshop wasn't just a building, it was the promised land. It was a cavernous, high-ceiling structure with a concrete floor thick enough to park a tank on, already wired with the heavy-duty power I needed. Inheriting it felt like winning the lottery. The property was located in a development called Maple Creek Estates. It was one of those places that had started as a few scattered country homes and then got swallowed by suburbia. My grandfather's plot was one of the original ones, which meant his house was older and his land more spacious than the newer, cookie-cutter homes that had sprung up around him over the last 20 years. He'd always grumbled about the homeowners association that came with the development, calling them a gaggle of gossiping geese with nothing better to do. For the most part, though, they'd left him alone. His property was on the edge of the development, slightly set apart, and he was grandfathered in on so many things that it was easier for the HOA to just look the other way. After the funeral and the initial whirlwind of paperwork, I finally had the keys in my hand. I spent the first week just getting a feel for the place, walking the property line and making plans. The house was dated but solid, filled with the scent of old books and my grandfather's pipe tobacco. It was the workshop, though, that held my focus. I could already see it in my mind's eye. My welding table over here, the plasma cutter there, racks for steel lining the far wall. It was perfect. The previous HOA board, from what I gathered, had been a mostly benign entity. They collected dues, made sure the common areas were mowed, and organized a yearly block party. It was a low-key, functional arrangement that kept things tidy without stepping on anyone's toes. But that had changed recently. According to the few neighbors I'd had a chance to speak with, a new president had taken the helm about a year ago. Her name was Carol Preston. Carol had moved into the neighborhood about 4 years prior, and through a combination of aggressive volunteering and sheer force of will, had managed to get herself elected president. The early signs of her reign were small but telling. First came the memo about approved mailbox colors. All mailboxes were to be a specific shade of forest green, purchased from a specific supplier. Then came the regulations on lawn maintenance, specifying a grass height between 2 and 4 inches to be enforced with weekly inspections. Holiday decorations were next, with strict timelines for both their installation and removal. The community, accustomed to its relaxed atmosphere, grumbled. Most people complied just to avoid the hassle, but a current of resentment was beginning to simmer just beneath the surface. I heard all this in passing, but I didn't pay it much mind. I figured, like my grandfather, I was far enough on the fringe to be left alone. I was wrong. The day of the first real confrontation was a crisp autumn Saturday. I had decided it was time to officially take possession of the workshop. I walked from the house across the gravel driveway, a heavy set of my own tools in hand. I approached the large roll-up door, the main entrance to the workshop, and inserted the old worn key my grandfather's lawyer had given me. It slid into the lock but wouldn't turn. I tried it a few times, jiggling it, but it was no use. The lock was seized, or, more likely, it had been changed. A flicker of annoyance went through me. Maybe my grandfather had changed it and forgotten to tell anyone. I walked around to the side entrance, a standard man door. Same story. The key wouldn't work. Now I was getting frustrated. I peered through one of the grimy windows. It was dark inside, but I could make out shapes that didn't belong. There were tall metal shelving units, neatly organized with plastic bins. That wasn't my grandfather's style. He operated on a system of organized chaos, with tools and projects spread out on every available surface. This was tidy, clinical. There was no way I was waiting. I went back to my truck, grabbed a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, and returned to the man door. With a satisfying snap, the cheap padlock that had been added below the main handle broke free. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, flicking on the lights. The sight that greeted me was baffling. The cavernous space had been transformed. Half of the workshop was filled with racks upon racks of clothing, boxes of shoes, and tables laden with jewelry and handbags. There was a packing station with rolls of bubble wrap, shipping labels, and stacks of cardboard boxes. It was a full-blown commercial enterprise, an online boutique operating out of my inheritance. I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was seeing. My grandfather had never mentioned this. There was no lease agreement in his papers, no record of rental income in his bank statements. This entire operation was a mystery. As I walked deeper into the space, taking in the sheer scale of it, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel outside. A moment later, a golf cart, the kind favored by overzealous community managers everywhere, zipped into view and stopped abruptly. A woman in her late 50s with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a pastel pink tracksuit hopped out. She had a face that looked like it was permanently pinched from smelling something unpleasant. She marched toward the open workshop door, her eyes blazing. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. "This is a private business space." I was taken aback by her immediate hostility. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, gesturing to the rows of merchandise. "This is my workshop. Who are you?" "I am Carol Preston, president of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, as if presenting royal credentials. "And you are trespassing. I have a business to run here." I couldn't help but let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Trespassing? I inherited this property. This building belongs to me. You're the one who's trespassing." Carol's face hardened. "I had an arrangement with the previous owner," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "He was happy to let me use this unused space for a community-enriching enterprise." "An arrangement?" I countered, my patience wearing thin. "Funny, because I've been through all of my grandfather's records. There's no lease, no rental agreement, and certainly no sign of any payment for the last 4 years you've apparently been squatting here. So, let's see it. Show me the paperwork for this arrangement." A flicker of panic crossed her eyes before being replaced by pure, unadulterated rage. "The details of my arrangement are none of your business. This is now an HOA matter," she snapped. "According to Bylaw 7.4c, all outbuildings on properties within Maple Creek must be maintained to community standards and cannot be used for unapproved commercial activities." The sheer audacity of her argument was breathtaking. She was quoting a rule against commercial activity while standing in the middle of her own unauthorized commercial operation, which she had set up on my property. "You can't be serious," I said, shaking my head. "You're running a business here, and you're trying to use an HOA rule to stop me from using my own building for my business." "My business has been vetted and is a known entity," she retorted, her voice rising. "Your metal banging is a noisy, dirty industrial activity that has no place in a residential community. You are in violation. I am warning you, Mark. Do not interfere with my operations here. If you touch any of my inventory or attempt to remove me from this space, I will begin fining you $500 a day. And I will put a lien on this property so fast your head will spin." She punctuated her threat by pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. I just stared at her, my initial annoyance solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. She had been taking advantage of my grandfather, and now she thought she could bully me into letting her continue. She had no idea who she was dealing with. My grandfather taught me many things, and one of them was to never let a bully win. "Get your things," I said, my voice low and calm. "I want all of this junk out of my workshop by the end of the weekend, and get off my property. Now, she scoffed, a nasty, dismissive sound. You'll be hearing from the HOA's legal counsel, she spat, before turning on her heel, climbing back into her golf cart and speeding away, leaving a trail of dust and righteous indignation in her wake. I stood in the doorway of my workshop, surrounded by another person's life and business, and knew that my quiet, peaceful move was officially over. The first thing I did after Carol's dramatic exit was to change the locks. All of them. I drove to the hardware store and bought the heaviest-duty deadbolts and padlocks they had. I spent the rest of the afternoon installing them on the workshop doors, making the place as secure as Fort Knox. Then, for good measure, I printed out a dozen large, professional-looking, no trespassing signs and plastered them on every door and window. It felt a little dramatic, but after her threats, I wasn't taking any chances. True to her word, the first official notice arrived on Monday. It was in a crisp, HOA-branded envelope, left conspicuously tucked into my front door. The letter, written in a florid and officious tone, cited 3 separate bylaw violations. First, the unapproved modification to an outbuilding, which I presumed was my changing of the locks. Second, the display of unauthorized signage, referring to my no trespassing signs. And third, the most galling of all, interference with a pre-approved community-based commercial enterprise. The letter informed me that I was being fined $100 for each violation, per day, retroactive to Saturday. A running total of $900 was printed at the bottom. I read the letter twice, my disbelief mounting. She was fining me for securing my own property against her. It was absurd. It was extortion. I crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash. I figured I would ignore her, that she would eventually realize she had no legal leg to stand on. This was a mistake. The letters kept coming, each one with an updated, ever-increasing total. By the end of the first week, the debt she claimed I owed was over $2,000. One morning, I was woken by a loud banging on the side of the workshop. I looked out the kitchen window and saw Carol, dressed in another immaculate tracksuit, yanking furiously on the new padlock I had installed. She had a crowbar in her hand and was trying to pry the hasp from the doorframe. I stormed out of the house, my blood boiling. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" I yelled as I crossed the driveway. She spun around, startled, the crowbar still in her hand. "I am accessing my inventory. I have orders to fill. You are illegally withholding my property," she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. "I told you to get your things out last weekend," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You chose not to. Everything in that building is now considered abandoned property, and if you don't get off my land right now, I'm calling the sheriff and reporting you for trespassing and attempted breaking and entering." I pulled out my phone to emphasize the point. Her face went pale. The threat of actual law enforcement was something she hadn't counted on. She threw the crowbar to the ground with a clang. "This isn't over," she hissed. "The HOA will not be intimidated. You will regret this." She stomped back to her golf cart and sped off. The daily violation notices continued and the fines escalated. The letters now included threats of placing a lien on my property, a legal claim that could eventually lead to foreclosure. The sheer audacity was one thing, but the threat to the property my grandfather had worked his whole life for was another. This was no longer just an annoyance, it was a serious threat. I decided it was time to talk to my new neighbors. I needed to understand who I was dealing with and whether anyone else had been subjected to this kind of harassment. I started with the house next door, where an elderly man was meticulously tending his rose bushes. He introduced himself as Arthur Henderson. He'd lived in Maple Creek for over 30 years and had been a good friend of my grandfather. "Ah, so you're Frank's grandson," he said, his eyes twinkling as he shook my hand. "I was sorry to hear about his passing. He was a good man, a straight shooter." He paused, leaning on his trowel. "I see you've already met our esteemed queen, Carol Preston." I let out a sigh. You could say that. She seems to think my workshop belongs to her. Arthur chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "That woman," he said, shaking his head. "She's a piece of work. Moved in a few years back and decided the whole neighborhood was her personal fiefdom. bullied her way into the presidency, and has been making everyone miserable ever since. He gestured down the street with his trowel. See Mrs. Gable's house? The one with the ramp? Carol tried to fine her $2,000 because the ramp wasn't painted the HOA-approved shade of beige. The woman is in a wheelchair, for heaven's sake. My stomach tightened. This was worse than I thought. Carol wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was preying on the most vulnerable members of the community. Did she get away with it? I asked. Her son raised hell, and Carol eventually backed down, but not before terrorizing an 80-year-old woman for a month, Arthur said. Most people are too scared to fight her. She drowns them in paperwork and threatens them with lawyers. She even tried to fine the mail carrier because his truck was leaving unapproved tire marks on the asphalt. The conversation with Arthur was enlightening and deeply disturbing. Carol had created a climate of fear. People were paying absurd fines for things like leaving their garbage cans out an hour too long or having a garden gnome she deemed tacky. The community wasn't just apathetic. They were intimidated. They were isolated victims, each fighting their own small, losing battle against her. I realized then that my fight wasn't just about my workshop. If I let her win, it would only embolden her to terrorize everyone else even more. The final straw came a week later. A certified letter arrived from an expensive-looking law firm, formally notifying me of the HOA's intent to place a lien on my property for the sum of $15,400 in unpaid fines and legal fees. The number was utterly fabricated, a monument to Carol's vindictive fantasy. But the legal threat was real. A lien could cloud the title to my property, making it impossible to sell or refinance. It was a serious, tangible attack on my inheritance. That was it. The line had been crossed. This was no longer something I could handle on my own. I picked up the phone and made an appointment with a lawyer. I found a firm that specialized in real estate and contract law. My lawyer's name was Ben Davies. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man in his 40s, with a calm demeanor that I found immediately reassuring. I sat in his polished conference room and laid out the whole story, from inheriting the property to the boxes of boutique clothing in my workshop to the certified letter threatening a lien. I handed in the stack of violation notices I had saved. He listened patiently, read through the documents, and then looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Well, Mark," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you've certainly found yourself in a classic petty tyrant situation. This Carol Preston sounds like a real nightmare." "Can she actually do this?" I asked. "Can she just invent fines and put a lien on my house?" In theory, an HOA can place a lien for unpaid dues and legitimate fines if the process is followed correctly according to the governing documents and state law, he explained. However, the key word there is legitimate. Fining you for changing the locks on your own building or for putting up no trespassing signs is highly questionable. And her entire premise seems to be based on her unauthorized use of your property. It's a house of cards. But a house of cards can still cause a lot of damage if it falls on you. He told me that fighting it would be a long and expensive process if we played by her rules. We could dispute each fine, go to arbitration, and drag it through the courts. But he had another idea. The best way to fight a bully like this isn't to punch back, he said, a strategic glint in his eye. It's to pull the rug out from under them. We need to find a fundamental flaw in her authority. You said your grandfather's property was one of the original lots? That's right, I confirmed. It was here long before the rest of Maple Creek Estates was even a blueprint. That's our starting point, Davies said, a plan clearly forming in his mind. I want you to go back through every piece of paper your grandfather kept. Deeds, titles, surveys, anything related to the property. I'm going to go to the county records office and pull the original plat maps for the development and the HOA's articles of incorporation. Somewhere in that mountain of paper, there's a silver bullet. We just have to find it. Leaving his office, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I was on the offensive. The investigation had begun. I went home and started digging through the old filing cabinet in my grandfather's study. It was a treasure trove of history, filled with decades of meticulously kept records. I found the original deed from when he bought the land in 1965, old property tax receipts, and blueprints for the workshop. As I sifted through the dusty files, Arthur Henderson became my unofficial partner in the investigation. He would stop by in the evenings with tidbits of information he'd gleaned from other longtime residents. He brought me a copy of the original sales brochure for the first phase of the Maple Creek development from the late 80s. He remembered that my grandfather had a verbal agreement with the developer to have access to the new paved roads, but that he had explicitly refused to be formally annexed into the new community association. It was a small clue, but it felt significant. Meanwhile, Davies was doing his own digging at the county courthouse. He called me a few days later, his voice tight with excitement. "I think I've got something, Mark," he said. "It's better than I hoped. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow morning? And bring the original deed for your property." The next morning, I sat in that same conference room, the old brittle deed from 1965 spread out on the polished table. Davies laid another document next to it. It was a large, official-looking map, a county plat map from 1988, the year Maple Creek Estates was formally established. "This is the master plat for the development," Davies explained, tracing a thick red line on the map with his finger. "This line represents the legal boundary of the entire Maple Creek Estates subdivision, and therefore the legal jurisdiction of the HOA." He pointed to a small square cutout on the very edge of the map, a notch in the otherwise clean boundary line. "And this," he said, tapping the cutout, "is your property. Lot 7, Block A, as described in your grandfather's original deed. It was never incorporated into the subdivision. It's legally, officially, and unequivocally a separate parcel." I stared at the map, the implications slowly dawning on me. "So, what does that mean?" Davies grinned, a wide, triumphant grin. "It means your property has never been part of the Maple Creek Estates HOA. Not ever. Your grandfather was never legally obligated to be a member, pay dues, or follow a single one of their rules. He was, for all intents and purposes, a non-member who lived next door." The room was silent for a moment as the full weight of the discovery settled over me. All of it, the fines, the threats, the lien, Carol's entire basis for authority over me, was a complete and utter fraud. She wasn't just misinterpreting the bylaws. She was trying to enforce them on a property where she had zero jurisdiction. It was like getting a speeding ticket from the government of France while driving in Ohio. "She has no power over you, Mark," Davies said, his voice ringing with finality. "None. She's a trespasser, a squatter, and she's been attempting to extort you using the fraudulent authority of an organization that has no legal standing on your land." This was it. This was the revelation, the silver bullet we had been looking for. It changed everything. We were no longer on the defensive, trying to parry her attacks. We now held the weapon that could dismantle her entire reign of terror. "So what's our next move?" I asked, my mind racing with the possibilities. "Do we send her a cease and desist, sue her?" Davies held up a hand. "Patience. A simple letter won't do. A woman like Carol Preston doesn't respond to being proven wrong. She just doubles down. We can't just win. We have to make sure she can never do this to anyone ever again. We need to expose her, publicly and completely." Our strategy shifted from defense to a carefully planned offensive. The first step was to quantify the damages. Davies advised me to hire a commercial real estate appraiser to determine the fair market rental value for a commercial space the size of my workshop. The appraiser came back with a figure of $2,000 per month. Carol had been operating her business there for just over 4 years. We did the math. 48 months at $2,000 a month came to $96,000. Next, we looked at utilities. I found my grandfather's old utility bills. The electricity consumption for the property had been unusually high for a retired man living alone. We cross-referenced the spike in usage with the time Arthur Henderson said Carol had moved into the neighborhood and started her arrangement. It was a perfect match. She hadn't just been using the space for free. She'd been running her business on my grandfather's dime. We calculated the overage, which added several thousand more dollars to her bill. Armed with this information, I drafted a formal invoice. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Invoice for unlawful occupation and use of commercial space." It detailed the back rent, the cost of utilities, the price of the new locks, and my own administrative time. The grand total was a little over $100,000. It was a shocking number, but it was real, and it was legally justifiable. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Arthur came to me with a piece of gossip that turned out to be pure gold. The HOA was holding its quarterly meeting in 2 weeks. The main item on the agenda, pushed by Carol herself, was a formal vote to authorize the law firm to proceed with the lien against my property. She was so confident in her power that she was going to ask the entire community to be her accomplices. It was the perfect stage for our counterattack. "She's handing us the microphone," Davies said when I told him. "We won't have to fight to be heard. She's going to invite us right up on stage." In the 2 weeks leading up to the meeting, a quiet rebellion was brewing. Arthur Henderson, now fully engaged as my co-conspirator, went door to door. He didn't share the details of our legal discovery. We were saving that for the main event, but he encouraged everyone who had ever been wronged by Carol to attend the meeting. He spoke to Mrs. Gable's son, a quiet man who, it turned out, was a detective with the county sheriff's office. He told him he might want to be there. The seeds of dissent were sown. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. Usually, these meetings were attended by Carol and her 2 cronies on the board, with maybe 1 or 2 other residents. Tonight, it was standing room only. The air was thick with anticipation. I saw faces from all over the neighborhood, the young couple she'd fined for their children's excessively noisy sidewalk chalk art, the man she'd cited for having a political sign in his yard 2 days after the election, and of course, Mrs. Gable, sitting in her wheelchair in the front row, accompanied by her detective son. Carol, perched at the head table with her 2 board members, looked momentarily surprised by the turnout, but quickly recovered, a smug smile spreading across her face. She likely assumed everyone was there to witness her final triumph over the neighborhood troublemaker. She called the meeting to order, her voice echoing with self-importance. After rattling through some mundane business, she arrived at the main event. "And now," she announced, her eyes finding me in the crowd, "we move to Agenda Item 5A, Resolution to enforce collection of delinquent fees against the property at 1287 Old Mill Road." She then launched into a 10-minute tirade, painting me as a disrespectful, uncooperative freeloader who was threatening the very fabric of their peaceful community with my industrial ambitions. She detailed the fines I had accrued, presenting the staggering fabricated total as fact. She concluded by asking the board for a motion to approve the lien. One of her cronies dutifully made the motion. Carol looked out at the crowd, her smile triumphant. "All in favor?" Before anyone could speak, a calm, clear voice cut through the room. "Point of order, Madam President." All heads turned. Ben Davies, dressed in a sharp suit and holding a leather briefcase, stood up from his seat beside me. He walked calmly to the front of the room. Carol stared at him, her smile faltering. "Who are you?" she demanded. "My name is Ben Davies. I am legal counsel for Mark Fletcher, the owner of the property at 1287 Old Mill Road," he said. "And before this board takes a vote that would expose it and every member of this HOA to significant legal liability, I have some information to present." A murmur went through the crowd. Carol's face tightened. "This is a closed meeting for members only." "Excellent point," Davies replied smoothly, "which is why it's so important to establish who, exactly, is a member." He pulled a large, rolled-up document from his briefcase and unfurled it. It was a high-quality print of the county plat map. He taped it to the wall for everyone to see. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is the official, legally binding plat map for the Maple Creek Estate subdivision, as filed with the county in 1988, he began, his voice projecting through the suddenly silent room. He used a laser pointer to trace the red boundary line. "As you can see, the HOA's jurisdiction is clearly defined by this border. And as you can also see," he said, aiming the red dot at the conspicuous cutout, "the property at 1287 Old Mill Road sits entirely outside that border. It was never annexed. It was never made a part of this subdivision. It is, and always has been, a completely separate legal entity." A collective gasp went through the room. You could feel the entire power dynamic shift in that single moment. Carol's face went from smug to confused to horrified in the span of about 5 seconds. She stared at the map as if she could will the lines to change. "Therefore," Davies continued, his voice like a hammer striking an anvil, "this HOA has absolutely no authority over Mr. Fletcher or his property. None. Every violation notice you have sent, every fine you have levied, and this entire action to place a lien are legally baseless. It is an act of fraud." He wasn't finished. He let the word fraud hang in the air for a moment before turning his attention directly to Carol. "Which brings me to my second point," he said, pulling another document from his briefcase. "While my client owes this HOA nothing, there is the matter of what you, Ms. Preston, owe my client." He held up the invoice. "This is a bill for 48 months of unpaid rent for your commercial use of my client's private property, calculated at fair market value. It also includes reimbursement for utilities you consumed while running your for-profit business. The total amount due," he announced, his voice ringing with authority, "is $103,241. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting. Carol was as white as a sheet, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But Davies still wasn't done. He held up a hand for silence. "And finally," he said, his gaze now sweeping over the 2 horrified board members sitting next to Carol, "I have here copies of the HOA's own financial statements, which are a matter of public record for the members. And I also have the utility bills for Mr. Fletcher's property for the past 4 years. He held up the 2 sets of documents. "It's interesting to note that the HOA's electricity budget saw a mysterious and significant increase at the exact same time the electricity usage at my client's vacant workshop skyrocketed. It seems, Ms. Preston, that you weren't just using my client's property for free. You were using the HOA's money, your neighbor's money, to pay the power bill for your private business." He paused, letting the accusation land. "There's a word for that. It's called embezzlement." That was the final blow. The collapse was total and immediate. Carol began to sputter, a string of incoherent denials. Her supporters on the board looked at her with dawning horror, realizing the legal jeopardy she had just placed them in. Just then, Mrs. Gable's son, the detective, stood up from the front row. He walked calmly to the front, pulled out his badge, and faced a stunned Carol Preston. "Ms. Preston," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of the law. "Based on the evidence presented here tonight, which corroborates an ongoing investigation into multiple complaints of fraud and extortion, you are being placed under criminal investigation for embezzlement of HOA funds. I'd advise you not to leave town." The meeting devolved into complete chaos. Carol, finally broken, let out a strangled sob and stumbled out of the room. Her reign was over. It hadn't ended with a whimper, but with a spectacular, public implosion. I stood in the back of the room next to Arthur, who clapped me firmly on the shoulder. "Well done, son," he said, a broad smile on his face. "Frank would be proud." For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The war was won. The aftermath of that explosive meeting was swift and decisive. Carol Preston's world unraveled with astonishing speed. The detective, whose name I learned was David Gable, was true to his word. A formal criminal investigation was launched the very next day. Search warrants were executed on Carol's home, and with my permission, on the contents of my workshop. What they found was a far more extensive pattern of deceit than any of us had imagined. It turned out Carol had been treating the HOA's bank account as her personal slush fund for years. The embezzlement wasn't limited to paying the electricity for her boutique. She had used HOA funds to pay for her car repairs, her country club membership, and even a luxury cruise, all hidden under vague expense categories like community maintenance and administrative fees. She had created fake invoices from non-existent landscaping companies and paid them to a bank account she controlled. The fines she levied against residents weren't just about power. They were a source of revenue to cover her tracks. She was running a racket, and her obsession with controlling my workshop was partly because she needed a physical location to legitimize the ever-growing inventory for her business. which itself was a key part of her money laundering scheme. Carol was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including grand larceny, embezzlement, and fraud. Her two cronies on the board, facing legal jeopardy themselves, quickly turned state's evidence, testifying against her in exchange for immunity. The trial was a local spectacle. The prosecution, led by an ambitious young assistant district attorney, used the evidence Ben Davies and I had uncovered as the cornerstone of their case. The plat map, the invoice, the utility bills, they were all entered into evidence. One by one, residents of Maple Creek took the stand to testify about her campaign of harassment and extortion. Mrs. Gable's testimony about the wheelchair ramp was particularly damning. In the end, the jury was out for less than 2 hours. Carol was found guilty on all counts. The judge, citing her predatory abuse of a position of trust and her complete lack of remorse, sentenced her to 3 to 5 years in state prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA. Separately, Ben Davies filed a civil suit against her on my behalf. With the criminal conviction already secured, it was an open and shut case. The court granted me a default judgment for the full amount of the back rent and damages, over $100,000. A lien was placed not on my property, but on hers. With Carol gone, the cloud of fear over Maple Creek Estates lifted almost immediately. The old tainted HOA board was dissolved in disgrace. A special election was held to form a new one. Arthur Henderson, the wise elder who had been my staunchest ally, was unanimously elected as the new president. His first act was to call a community-wide meeting, not for rules and regulations, but for a barbecue. It was the first neighborhood gathering in years. The new board, under Arthur's guidance, undertook a complete reformation of the HOA. They hired an independent auditor to go through the books and hired Ben Davies to help them rewrite the bylaws from scratch. The new rules were simple, reasonable, and focused on maintaining property values and community safety without infringing on personal liberties. The forest green mailbox rule was abolished. The grass height regulation was replaced with a simple, keep it tidy guideline. The power to levy fines was severely restricted and placed under the oversight of a committee of residents. The era of the petty tyrant was over. An era of common sense and neighborly cooperation had begun. For my part, I was finally vindicated. All the ridiculous fines and the threat of the lien vanished as if they had never existed. The legal battle was over. I now had a judgment against Carol, but collecting it was another matter. Her assets were frozen, and the HOA was first in line for restitution. I didn't expect to see much of that money, and honestly, I didn't care. The victory wasn't about the cash, it was about the principle. The contents of her boutique remained in my workshop, tied up as evidence. Eventually, after the legal proceedings were finished, they were liquidated in a court-ordered auction. I used the opportunity to buy the heavy-duty metal shelving units for pennies on the dollar. It seemed a fitting, ironic end to her enterprise. With the space finally empty, I spent the next few months turning the workshop into the fabrication shop of my dreams. I rewired the electrical, installed a ventilation system, and moved my equipment in. The sound of my welder striking an arc, once a source of potential conflict, now felt like a sound of freedom. My reputation in the neighborhood was transformed. I was no longer the outsider, the troublemaker. I was the guy who took down Carol. People would wave as I drove past. Neighbors would stop by to chat while I worked, not with complaints, but with genuine curiosity and respect. I became the unofficial go-to guy for any problem that required a practical solution. I fixed a neighbor's broken lawnmower, welded a new hinge on the community gate, and helped Arthur build new benches for the common area park. I was finally living the quiet, productive life I had envisioned. But it was richer and more connected than I had ever expected. The community I had fought for had become my own. Several years passed. Maple Creek Estates thrived. Under Arthur's sensible leadership, the community spirit that Carol had tried so hard to extinguish was rekindled and burned brighter than ever. Property values rose, not because of draconian rules, but because it had become a genuinely wonderful place to live. A neighborhood where people knew each other, helped each other, and respected each other's boundaries. The story of the battle for the warehouse became something of a local legend, a cautionary tale told to new residents about the dangers of unchecked petty power. My business flourished. With the workshop fully operational, I was able to take on bigger and more ambitious projects. The space my grandfather had built became a hub of creativity and craftsmanship. The rhythmic hum of my machines was now a familiar and welcome part of the neighborhood's soundscape. I was content, living and working on the land that had been in my family for decades, at peace with my neighbors and myself. One afternoon, I was at the local grocery store picking up a few things for dinner. As I was heading down an aisle, I saw a familiar figure stocking shelves in the canned goods section. Her hair was no longer a perfect blonde helmet. It was a mousy brown with gray roots showing. The designer tracksuit had been replaced by a drab, ill-fitting store uniform. It was Carol Preston. She had served her time and was out. Our eyes met for a brief second. I saw a flash of recognition, followed by shame and a deep, weary bitterness. She looked smaller, diminished, a ghost of the imperious queen she had once pretended to be. She quickly broke eye contact and turned her back, busying herself with a display of green beans. I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was no triumph, no desire for revenge. There was only a quiet, detached pity. She had built her kingdom on a foundation of lies and intimidation, and when it crumbled, it had buried her completely. I didn't say a word. I just pushed my cart past her and continued with my shopping. Her punishment was living this life, a life of anonymity and insignificance, forever haunted by the memory of the power she had abused and lost. Our final encounter wasn't a confrontation, but a silent acknowledgement of a chapter that was well and truly closed. Later that evening, as I stood in my workshop watching the sparks fly from my grinder, I reflected on the whole absurd ordeal. It was a stark reminder of how easily power, even on the smallest scale, can corrupt. Carol's reign was a textbook case of a petty tyrant who mistakes rules for justice and control for leadership. She saw the world through a lens of violations and compliance, and she couldn't comprehend a community built on mutual respect and common decency. Her obsession with enforcing the letter of the law, especially a law that didn't even apply, made her blind to the spirit of what a neighborhood should be. The experience taught me that you can't always just ignore a bully and hope they go away. Sometimes you have to stand your ground. Sometimes you have to fight back, not just for yourself, but for everyone who is too afraid to. My grandfather had been a quiet man who valued his independence. And in a way, my fight was a continuation of his legacy. I had defended the borders of his property, not just on a map, but as a principle. The principle that a person's home is their sanctuary, and that it should be protected from the intrusions of those who seek to dominate others through fear and fraudulent authority. Ultimately, Carol was the architect of her own downfall. Her greed and her arrogance led her to overplay her hand so dramatically that she exposed her own corruption to the world. If she had simply accepted that she was trespassing and moved her business, none of it would have happened. But her ego wouldn't allow it. She had to win, had to be right, and that desperation was the crack in her armor that we were able to exploit. It's a funny thing about tyrants. They often provide you with the very tools you need to defeat them. The story of Maple Creek Estates is a testament to the strength of a community that decides it has had enough. It's about the importance of standing up, of asking questions, and of holding power accountable, no matter how small. My reluctant journey from a quiet metalworker to a community champion was over. I hadn't sought the role, but I was proud of the outcome. The peace in our neighborhood was a peace we had fought for and won together. Now, as I finish the day's work, I switch off the lights in the workshop and walk across the driveway to the house my grandfather built. The air is quiet, save for the distant sound of children playing and the gentle hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. I look out over the tidy lawns and the well-kept houses of Maple Creek, and I feel a profound sense of belonging. This is my home. Not just the plot of land on a deed, but the entire community. I came here looking for a place to work, and I ended up finding a place to live. And that, I realized, was an inheritance far more valuable than any building or piece of land. It was the inheritance of a community restored, a peace hard won, and a quiet life, finally, truly achieved.